formation, you have cases where the most dominant way of making a compound in Persian is actually one where the noun is final, it's head final, and the modifier is before the noun, and you don't get the Ezafe. So for example, 7a, gulab, flower water, which is for rose water, prenominal, no Ezafe. Or for example, 7d, karkhune, workhouse, for factory, and so on. In this case, I should point out, and that comes in the examples in 8, that while the head final pattern is more dominant for sure, there are some compounds which with post-nominal modifiers that don't have the Ezafe, which could be a bit unexpected. So some of these examples are given in 8, Madar Bozorg, mother, big grand for grandmother, Pesar Amu, son, uncle for cousin. 8b, we have Ab Portugal, as opposed to, for example, Ab Sib. So for orange juice, we have water, orange, as opposed to Ab Sib with the Ezafe, but Ab Portugal has dropped the Ezafe. And Ab Sib, by the way, has also, I'll talk about that briefly in a second. But basically, what you see there is that the Ezafe seems to not be there even though you have a post-nominal modifier. What I would like to suggest is that the compounds in 8 are actually different from the ones in 7 in several ways. For one thing, the head final formation in 7 is much more productive than the apparently head initial ones. And also the ones in 8 are typically used with very frequent forms. So forms that have been used over time a lot, and then which to me suggests that actually they originated as an Ezafe construction, and over time with a lot of usage they've lost their Ezafe. And in fact, when you look at the juices, that's interesting because Ab Portugal has always been, orange juice, very common. With the other juices becoming more common in recent years, you can see the Ezafe being dropped, for example, even for apple juice. Ab C. But if you, for example, take lettuce and get the juice of lettuce, there's no way you can use Ab Kahu. It would have to be Ab Kahu, right, with the Ezafe. So I think there is really an issue there. I'm referring to these as historical compounds in the sense that historically there were the Ezafe, and the Ezafe has been lost over time. Okay, that's the sense I'm using, historical. As opposed to the true compounds, which for me are the head final ones. Also, the head initial ones are very transparent, which to me is another indication, semantically they're very transparent, which to me is another indication that they originate in some kind of syntactic phrase. With very few exceptions, by the way, which I have talked about in a footnote. So, as I said, I take the ones in 7 to be the true compounds, and the productive head final compound, to me, is an indication of the actual base position of nouns in Persian. So, which I think this view is better understood in a framework that takes all word formation to also be syntax, so syntax all the way down along the lines of distributed morphology. So basically, I think this should be an indication that Persian noun phrases are head final in their base position. But what I've tried to show basically in the past 15 minutes or so is summarized in 10 at the top of page 6 on your handout, which is this correlation between the Ezafe and the order of nominal elements. So you have either the noun followed by the Ezafe followed by the modifier, which is the most common way you have noun phrases. That's the fully productive syntactic way of forming noun phrases. Then you have the modifier before the noun. This happens very frequently with prenominal modifier, like the numeral, like the demonstrative, and the superlative, as well as it's also productive in compounds and the formal register. You have some cases of the noun followed by the modifier, which to me is limited to the historical what I call the historical compounds. And what's crucial is that you don't find 10b. There is no case of modifier followed by the Ezafe and then followed by the noun. That's something you don't find. So this picture in 10 shows a very clear asymmetry between pre-nominal and post-nominal modifiers, which requires an explanation. So looking at it sort of from a more cross-linguistic perspective, one might say that you should expect the Ezafe to occur only in languages which are actually head initial, right? If this correlation is we take it very seriously, then you might expect that in accordance with what we see in ND. There is some supporting evidence for this. All the West Iranian languages with Ezafe, such as Persian and some Kurdish dialects, I meant to say Hawrami and Kurmanchi, have a head initial status. And Ezafe is not found, for example, in languages such as Germanic languages, Romance language, and we'll see about other Iranian languages in a second as well. So, how do we explain this? And here we get to section 4, where I try to give an explanation for this, and this is where we get a bit to the syntax side of part of things and a little bit theoretical, hopefully clear enough. So basically, how do we account for this asymmetry that we find in 10? In the general tradition, typically when you find this kind of word order variation, you capture this kind of variation by syntactic movement, displacement. There is actually a large body of work, particularly inspired by Kane, 1994, his work on antisymmetry. Big enterprise of work from Cinque and Belletti and others looking at this issue. So there are two ways you can approach this. One is to say that the pre-nominal, the post-nominal Persian order is actually the base order. And you can derive the pre-nominal order via some kind of movement. This is in fact the line that Larson and Yamakido take. And the other one is to take the pre-nominal order, let's say what you see in sort of the base English order, as the basic, and derive the post-nominal order, which is the Persian type order. And that's what I'm going to be showing in this talk. So these two different positions, how do these possibilities actually relate to the issue of the presence of this Ezafe overt morphology, the Ezafe marker? For option 1, basically there's complementarity. So the idea would be that when there's overt morphology, there's no movement. When there is no morphology, then you need to move. Okay, so there's complementarity between movement and overt morphology. For the second option, in fact, movement and overt morphology go hand in hand. So when there is no movement, there's no morphology. When there is movement, there is morphology. Interestingly, when you look at the syntactic literature, you find precedence for both of these positions. So there's the idea of complementarity of movement and morphology, overt morphology, and this is of course most profoundly found in works of Lisa Cheng, for example, in the typology of WH questions. So, you either have a Q marker or, you just move the WH to the spec CP position. You have WH mode. So that kind of complementarity, but also in the realm of case, which is the one that Larson and Yamakido allude to, and we're going to come back to that. And that's exactly what they're going to say for Persian. Persian, there's Ezafe, no need to move. English, no Ezafe, you need to move to get case. This is what they say. So in the second type of relation you find in the literature is that connection between overt morphology and overt movement, and this is typically alluded to in the realm of agreement, and it's most famous in the work of Richard King with respect to Hungarian adposition. So when you have a post position, you get the agreement marker. When you don't, then you don't. And also people have used it for Arabic, the SVDS order, and whether you get number agreement or not. At least some have viewed it as that connection between movement, overt movement, and overt morphology. So, which is the approach taken in this talk, is that in Persian the overt morphology is actually realized as the reflex of this overt movement, the relation which establishes this relation between the modifier and the noun by this phrasal movement. Of course, the Ezafe has an invariant form in Persian. It doesn't agree with anything. But as we'll see later, and I'm sure many of you probably know here, some other Iranian languages with richer morphology, like Kurdish dialects, like Havrami Kurmanji, and then also separately Zazaki has the form Ezafe, shows agreement in 5 years. Zazaki is not a Kurdish dialect. This is, I think, the type of year, so it should have been excluded in that bracket. So fine features and other properties of the noun. So they show actual agreement, which we'll see in a little bit as well, which shows that maybe this type of view is actually on the right track. Okay, so let's look at this view of Larson, Richard Larson, that Ezafe is actually a case marker. So let's see how well this can capture the facts. So following Samiyan, Larson and Yamakito suggest that Ezafe is inserted to case license plates plus n elements. Plus n elements include nouns, of course, but also adjectives. And as we'll see, some prepositions in Persian are very nominal. So it includes these three categories. Crucially, they say that it doesn't include a relative clause because they're CPs, they don't need case, and not the PPs that are not nominal. The non-nominal prepositional phrases shouldn't take this as of it. Okay. And of course, just in brackets, like, you know, from a cross-linguistic perspective, they argue that a language like English, as I said, doesn't have this kind of element, so it needs to move. I think I mentioned that before. We can move on to page 8. I think some of the things I've said already probably create problems for this type of view, but instead of going through those, let's pick two major, I think, empirical problems with that analysis of Ezafe's case. And that comes down to relative clauses, right, and prepositional phrases. So for relative clauses being CPs, they say, okay, they don't require case, so they shouldn't take the Ezafe marker. They don't talk about reduced relative clauses in Persian, but given the discussion of English, one might expect reduced relative clauses to not take the Ezafe in Persian either. But as we can see in 11, as Sambelian actually has pointed out as well, in the reduced relative clause, you do need the Ezafe. In Javane as Swiss bargashte, akse chop shode dar ruzname. This young man who has returned from Switzerland, this is reduced, you don't have the verb. But Larson responds to that, I think, properly by saying that, well, reduced non-finite relative clauses, in fact, behave like nouns in a lot of languages. And they do behave like nouns in other ways in Persian as well. So we grant him that point. I think maybe that's not a big deal. So let's look at the finite, fully finite restricted relative clauses in Persian. As they, you would expect to never be nominal and not take the Ezafe marker. That might be true of Persian, modern Persian. I'll come back to that and, you know, suggest that maybe it's not true. But at first sight, maybe that's true of modern Persian. But when you look at historical, from a historical perspective, the Persian Ezafe is actually seen as a descendant of the old and Middle Persian relative connector. So I have this quote from Squervo, paraphrase. So he suggests that in Middle Persian, there are two ways to modify the noun. The modifying adjective can either be placed before the head noun, which he describes as the older and rarer construction, or it can be placed after the head noun by means of the relative connector. He calls it the relative connector, which he describes as a descendant of the old Persian relative connector and forerunner of the new Persian Ezafe. He basically says that. And the examples in 12a and b are interesting because they all once again show that pattern of pre-nominal modifier no Ezafe, post-nominal modifier Ezafe. But the crucial example is really 12c. Because in 12c, you actually see that, you know, this connector is also used in relative clauses. Even today, in other West in many West Iranian languages, which are closely related to Persian, Ezafe is used for both post-nominal modifiers as well as finite restricted relative clauses. And the examples in 13 are from Sambelian. They're from two Kurdish dialects, Sorani and Kurmanji. So you can see that the Ezafe is the same form, especially in 13a and 13b. The Ezafe is the same whether we have a post-nominal prepositional phrase or a post-nominal relative clause, you see the same form. The forms are a bit different in 13C and D because of the agreement marking. I couldn't find the exact same forms, but they're basically the same. The trust means just the agreement that shows up for the masculine and feminine agreement. In modern Persian, let's go back with this background. I'll go back to modern Persian restrictive relative clauses, and they're introduced with by this particle E, which people call the relative particle, and distinct from E. E and E, they're different. And because of this difference, Persian grammarians often state that the Ezafe is not used in the restrictive relative clause, which is a point that's picked up by Larson. But I've repeated the 11A example with the reduced relative clause in 14A, and I've given you the full relative clause in 14B. In جوان از سوئیس برگشته versus جوانی که از سوئیس برگشته است, right? And you can see that there are different forms. The particle itself has puzzled people, right? Linguists have wondered, what is this relative particle? I would like to suggest that in light of this discussion, we can perhaps take it to be an allomorph of the Ezafe marker, which is perhaps conditioned by the syntactic context of the full relative clause. If that's the case, then we can take even modern Persian CP to be a problem for the case story of Ezafe. But I think the strongest argument against that case story comes from prepositional phrases. Now, when you look at prepositional phrases, turning to page 10, we need to make a distinction again for those of you who are not familiar with the Iranian languages or Persian here. There are two types of prepositions. One group of prepositions behave very much like nouns. Okay, and I agree with them. They're right. Larson says that. Everybody has agreed that that's what they are. And there's this other group which is presumably the true prepositions. The ones that are nominal, you can pluralize them, you can even make adjectives out of them, you can do stuff with them, that's very nominal. And the ones that are non-nominal, you can't. And in addition to that, the nominal ones take Ezafe, the non-nominal ones don't take Ezafe, right? So which is the key point here. So in 15, the nominal ones, zira sandali, under the chair, balay miz. Sometimes you can drop these Ezafes in this particular context for some of them. Okay, we don't want to get into that. But you can put the Ezafe on them. Crucially, with the ones that are true prepositions, you cannot use the Ezafe for them. So you can't say garig and jig means that's a different meaning. But to mean in the closet, you can't do it. Or boye madar or something with mother, like you just can't put the Ezafe on it. So they don't take the Ezafe. Okay, so far so good. That part is not the issue. Okay, all of us have to say that the nominal ones take the Ezafe, they say the same thing. Here's the problem. They predict that the ones that are non-nominal, the 16 ones, if you put them in a prepositional phrase, they should not need case. So they should not need the Ezafe before it. Okay, so they should not need the Ezafe on the noun that goes before that prepositional phrase, because they should not need case. Remember, the case is for the thing that follows it, not the thing that goes before it. Okay, but they do, and that's a big problem. So we look at a PP like, Muhammad aks dar ganje ro be Ali dad. You need the Ezafe there. You need the Ezafe there, and dar ganje is a PP that's non-nominal. It shouldn't need it. So I think this is probably the strongest argument against the case story of Ezafe. Okay, I might need to speed up a bit. So that's that. So turning to the other approach for the word order variations, one which takes the prenominal English order to modify it as basic and derives the post-nominal ones. There are two possibilities. One possibility is to say that there's head movement involved, and the other one is to say there's phrasal movement involved. Both of them have been suggested in the literature. I think more recently most people suggest phrasal movements, but to establish that, maybe we need to say something about that, and maybe very briefly I'll mention it. I'll let you look at it later. So in section 4.2, basically I'm trying to show a head movement doesn't work because these things are bigger than heads, essentially. Looking at something like 18a, پر از جمعیت is it's a pretty full phrase. سالن پر از جمعیت سینما، رفتار خیلی دور از انتظار شهردار. So خیلی دور از انتظار, very far from expectation, that's a full phrase, so we need phrasal movement. So I'm going to skip to section 4.3, looking at the roll-up movement, which is the analysis that I'm going to give for the Persian Ezafe construction, the roll-up movement. This goes back to Cinque's more recent work on the order of adjectives and noun phrase, his 2010 monograph. So in this monograph, he suggests that the base order of noun phrases is universally head final. And he suggests that he used to have this system where all adjectives had a very strict order. He's given that up, and now there's much more flexibility. He suggests that there are two basic domains, right? So there's the direct modification, which is lower in the structure, and there's the indirect modification, which is higher in the structure. The direct modification is where you have they're rigidly ordered, they're low, they're associated with individual level readings, with non-restrictive readings, and with non-intersective readings. The indirect modification adjectives are higher in the structure, they have a reduced relative clause as their base. They're not rigidly ordered, and they have a stage level reading, restrictive reading, and intersective reading. Maybe in the meantime, you can kind of look at 13, page 13 in 19, just to see the structure, to kind of visualize this. Okay, so the indirect modification are higher in the tree, direct modification lower. Just to, for those of you who are not following that literature very closely, I decided to put an English example in there. So if you look at something, a visible star, the first visible means visible now. The second, which is the stage level reading, whereas the second one means generally visible, right? That's the individual level reading. That's the lower adjective. First visible is the higher one. Or if you take an example like his unsuitable acts, it could mean those of his acts which were unsuitable. It's a restrictive reading. Or it could mean that all of his acts, which happen to be unsuitable, that's a non-restrictive reading. Again, restrictive would be the higher one, non-restrictive would be the lower one. And finally, if you say the beautiful, beautiful dancer, the first beautiful refers to the beauty of the person, okay? But the second one is the beauty of the dancing. So the first one is intersective, higher. The second one is non-intersective, lower. I've given, as I said in 13, a slightly revised version of Cinque's general schema. I should mention briefly, though, that I'm not really, married to this particular way of, giving the strike. It could be that this follows from semantics, as Ernst has suggested. See a familiar face back there. As Ernst has suggested. But the key for me is that this order is given, right? How it comes about, whether it's really syntactically like that or based on semantic scope, is not the key issue for me. Anyway. But crucially, any variation from this order is the result of phrasal movement for Cinque. Okay, so so which is basically the approach that I extend to the Persian Ezafe construction, a roll-up analysis. So the DP, as I said, is taken to be head final. NP is marked at the bottom, and the APs that the modifiers are in these specified positions of these functional projections above it. The demonstrative and the numeral are heads, they're higher up in the tree. And this is basically, I'm talking about the structure in 20 on the following, on page 14. Okay, so you might want to start looking at that. There's a typo somewhere, I say 31, it's actually 20 in this paragraph, but anyway, don't worry about it. So 20 is what you want to look at. So, as we see in some Iranian language, as I said, and we'll see later, this agreement status of these intermediate, because I've used these agreement projections, which is very common in this literature, for these intermediate projections where the roll-up happens, and as we've seen, we'll see in a few minutes, this agreement shows up actually in a lot of non-Iranian language, other Iranian languages, so you do see phi agreement on the Ezafe. So the Ezafe marker in this view can be seen as a surface realization of the suggested inversion process, which is a linker in the sense of Den Dicken 2006. Crucially, the height of the movement corresponds to Ezafe. So as far as the NP goes, you get Ezafe, and where it stops, you don't get Ezafe anymore. And I've tried to explain in my 2014 paper that this is actually related to head phrase status of these modifiers. So it stops where it hits a head, essentially, to put it in simple terms. Okay, so that's the structure in 20. Maybe we can skip to 20, just have a quick look at that. Essentially what you see is, well, you're looking at your handouts, but the NP moves to the specifier, you know, there's some head movements, Y to the agger, and then that whole thing, that whole agger YP moves up. So as you can imagine, if you try to visualize it, you get the mirror image order. So if you have the A1 and N moving together to that position, then you get A1 and A2 will essentially reverse position. So you get mirror image order of the adjectives. So if you have A3, A2, A1, in the end you get N, A1, A2, A3, right? So this gets the mirror image order of elements. This makes some predictions. According to Cinque, 2010, direct modification adjectives are rigidly ordered, while indirect modification adjectives are not, right? So, and he argues that many adjectives can either have a direct or an indirect modification source. That's why you can say the big red dog, which is probably the most natural way of saying it, but you can also say the red big dog. I mean, this is, this is how he responded to some of the criticisms to his older work when he had everything rigidly ordered. That's because red can also be an indirect modification. It doesn't have to be direct, so it can be higher up. The same is true of Persian. You can say sag qermez buzurg or sag buzurg qermez with the difference in order like that. But here's the key thing: if unambiguously direct modification adjectives are used. English shows a strict order, and that's when in the roll-up analysis you should expect the mirror image order to be very strict, and I think that's true. So in English, if you want to say a young nuclear physicist, not a nuclear young physicist would sound very strange. The same thing is true of Persian. It shows the exact mirror image, so you get fizikdane hastei javan, right? Physicist, nuclear, young, which is the mirror image. The other order would be odd. I have to skip section 4.3 where I talk about the superlative a little bit in more detail and move on to the summary, because I do want to talk about the other Iranian languages, and I think we're kind of reaching the point where we have about, depending on whether I want to give 10 or 15 minutes, I have around 10 minutes or so, so maybe I'll just skip to, I mean, if we have time, I'll be happy to talk about the superlatives, okay? So just to give a summary, it's important to kind of remember what the properties of the Ezafe are. One, it appears with post-nominal modifiers and never with pre-nominal modifiers. Two, it appears with adjectives, possessors, as well as PP modifiers, prepositional phrases, reduced relative clauses, and arguably, this is just talking about Persian at least, arguably with full relative clauses. Third thing, Ezafe is not present with a superlative adjective, which are also pre-nominal. Ezafe never appears on a bare noun or on a predicative adjective. I didn't show this, but this becomes relevant because of some work of Franco Savoia and others who have suggested that this is possible in some other language. We'll see that. So you don't get it on a predicative adjective, right? It has to be within a noun phrase. And then, crucially, Ezafe is iterative. You get it in again and again, and as the more adjectives you add, you get more Ezafes. And finally, one thing I missed, Ezafe is obligatory, right? Except for those prepositions, but overall, when you need it, you have to have it. It's not like something you can drop. So these are crucial. Why are these important? Because looking at other languages, we have to keep these in mind and check whether this is true of these other languages. I'll come back to this when we look at these other languages, and I'll tell you what I mean. So looking at some other Iranian languages, as I said, I've just started looking at other languages, and this is very, very exploratory and really very tentative. But looking at grammars, you come across languages that don't have Ezafe, right? Famously, for example, Pashto, you have pre-nominal adjectives. And sorry if the transcriptions are not right or something, because I just tried to make it simple. And I know there's some experts here. So white car, there's no ezafe, pre-nominal adjective, kind of like English order. Those big books, same thing. This is from Pashto. There are two other East Iranian languages exemplified here. One, both Pamir languages, Shugni and Waki. So again, we have pre-nominal adjective. The only difference is that in Shogni you get actually agreement of the adjective with the noun. So there's gender agreement. And then same thing in Waki, you don't get agreement, very similar to Pashto in terms of its order. So that's that. Then of course you have the Ezafe languages, of course Persian. I don't want to give Persian examples again. But then you have some example like Harachi, which is a northwestern Iranian language. You get post-nominal modifiers with Ezafe, and from at least what this grammar says, you can have pre-nominal modifiers, and then there's no Ezafe, which again shows that kind of correlation which I've tried to push for. So boy Ezafe, little, I'm not going to try to pronounce it, and then little boy with no Ezafe. We have looked at Sorani and Kurmanji. That's what we saw with the examples from Sambelian, Sorani and Kurmanji. We have post-nominal adjective with Ezafe. With the Ezafe itself agrees in 5 features with the head noun. 5 features meaning number, gender, right? Of course, there's no person in the noun phrase. But here's what's interesting. So I have an example from Bahdini Kurmanji. This is an example that Franco and Manzini and Savoia use, where apparently in this dialect, Ezafe can be used independently of nominal modification. You can even use it before a predicative adjective. And they use this to support their analysis of Ezafe as a D element that selects the adjective. So they're trying to say, you get the noun, the constituent is actually Ezafe and the adjective. Very counterintuitive for Persian speakers, but that's okay. It could be the right analysis. As linguists, we can't just take our intuition to mean much. Obviously, phonologically, the Ezafe goes with the noun. Nobody can deny that. But maybe there's some syntax phonology mismatch. We're used to that looking at across languages, so that shouldn't be the big. But there's something very strange about that. And then the fact they give is from this Bahdini Kurmanji. So the problem I have with this kind of analysis is you can't start with the assumption that, okay, I go see the linker, it's Ezafe. Like everything, we start with the assumption that everything is Ezafe, so I can use this example from this language, that example from that language, this other example. We need to look at each language very carefully, because what about Persian that does not allow this? So it could very well be that in Persian, you have a different story from something that seems to be related. Okay, I'll come back to this again when I want to sort of end the talk. But just looking at Bahdini Kurmanji doing it at least justice and looking at the example, they even in fact give examples where the Ezafe appears before finite verbs, which would be very strange for Persian. So we have something like third person singular, he, she, and then we have the Ezafe, so she is big. You basically get this Ezafe before big, which is a predicative adjective. I haven't done any field work on any of these languages that I've cited here. All of this from grammars, okay? So I've trusted the grammars and the literature that's out there. Zazaki has an interesting case because of this agreement pattern. Maybe it's worth saying a few words about that. So we have post-nominal in Zazaki with Ezafe agreeing in 5 features, number and gender, and also case. That's interesting. So in Zazaki you have a two-way case distinction. You either have nominative or oblique. And when you look at the noun phrase, then inside this Ezafe also agrees, so for example in 30A, when you have the nominative dog, then the Ezafe shows masculine singular agreeing with dog, but also nominative because it's a nominative noun phrase. But when you have an oblique noun phrase, like again, I see the big dog in 30B, then you get the oblique marking on the Ezafe. Interestingly, when it's used in the possessive construction, then you only get oblique. Okay? Even if you put it in a nominative position, you get oblique. And that's because the case on the head noun is oblique. So it agrees with that. So sorry, on the possessor, of course, this is oblique, right? So if you look at 31A and 31B, you can see that there's oblique regardless of that. And then Sarvandi and Van Eyck come up with a story that involves upward move agreement and downward agreement. I think it's too complicated. I haven't worked out the details, but I think the system I've showed here probably can take care of the agreement you see here. Crucially, though, it doesn't matter who the possessor. If the possessor is feminine, if you take alik and replace with fatik, which is feminine, the Ezafe still agrees with the head noun. So the phi agreement is with the head noun. The case agreement is with the. I mean, you could call it concord actually. So depending on what view you have of concord. The most interesting case is the last one, which is what people have referred to as reverse Ezafe. So the question I have is, okay, if given the established correlation between the order of the noun and its modifiers in the Persian Ezafe construction, what we saw in 10, could we ever have anything resembling the Ezafe in a language which has head final NP? And if we have something like that, would this be a counter example to the generalization I had in 10? So basically in Persian you never get that kind of thing. So what about these other languages? And in fact, Larson talks about them and calls them reverse Ezafe. Basically, you get a modifier, this thing that he calls reverse Ezafe, and the noun, and uses Gilaki and Mazandarani as examples. He has several examples. All of them, I think, are questionable for different reasons. I picked the ones that looked more straightforward. So the Gilaki example, Sorche Gol, read this schwa, I put a schwa, trying to be neutral about what it is, and then flower, red flower, and then for Mazandarani we have big, this A, and then house, big house. And then another example from Masali, both of these are northwestern Iranian languages, Caspian language, and then there is the Taleshi dialect, Masali, which is also in the same region, roughly. So then you get again the red and this vowel and door for red door. So I've not looked at Masali and Mazandarani at all, but with the help of 2 undergraduate students over last summer, we reviewed this grammar of Gilaki closely, and we sifted through about 150 pages of text. And the Gilaki data we have in 35 to 38 are all from this grammar book. Interestingly, we found about a couple hundred examples of modified noun phrases, right? So nouns with some adjective. Over half of them had the Ezafe, right? So in fact, which again could be a contact issue. I don't know historically. It would be interesting. I haven't done that, but look at the historical text if there's anything to see how much of that you find in those. But this is what we have. And Larson, of course, also talks to a speaker who's modern speaker of Gilaki and was other. So room, Ezafe, empty. A lot of examples like that. The rest, about 100, had cases which could be that reverse Ezafe. All of them, except one, had postpositions, right? So they were the noun followed by this schwa, and then the postposition. And of those, half of them had the same postposition mian, which is inside, which in Persian could also be very, or in between, which is very nominal actually. And the rest were other postpositions like durun, inside, ru, on, amara, with, and wasi, for, and so on, a few others. And I've given 4 examples in 36. So abe mian, water inside, darevika, and so on. So abe, so water from, you get that as a fit. So for these, there is this possibility that these are actually genitive marking, instances of genitive marking, which is how all of them are glossed actually in the grammar. All of them have gen under it. Of course, we know adpositions assign genitive case to their nominal complements in a lot of languages. So, for example, Arabic. Also, given that in Persian at least, and some Iranian languages, these adpositions are sometimes very nominal. That raises that possibility, which works very well for mian, but definitely not so much for ba, for example. With for Persian wouldn't be one of them. And crucially, when you look at possessive constructions, I'll be a couple more minutes. I'll finish. sorry. Look at the possessive constructions like 37A, for example. You can see that the genitive is actually used. It's prenominal, unlike Persian, and you get the genitive marking. So deer's eyes. And even with possessive pronouns, you get prenominal, which is also very much unlike Persian. So my sisters. And the only one example of a prenominal adjective with such a marking in that particular grammar is given in 38, which is small beard, and it has that schwa. And interestingly, at some point in the grammar book, the authors say that this schwa is productively used to form adjectives and adverbs and nouns. So there's that other possibility that this could be some kind of an adjectivizer. So I think, apart from what I've tried to do, maybe concluding, I've showed that there's a near perfect correlation between the order of nouns and other nominal elements and the presence of Ezafe marker in Persian, where the noun clearly demarcates the distribution of the Ezafe marker. I argued that these facts can be captured in a system which takes the merged position of the noun to be head final and the order derived by a roll-up phrasal movement. We looked briefly at the status of Ezafe and Ezafe-like elements in some other Iranian languages and observed a good range of variation. In order to gain a better understanding of the nature and typology of these linker elements, we obviously need to look at much more data, more closely. But here's what's crucial, and this is something maybe I said before and I'm repeating here, is that we can't just start with the assumption that all of these linkers are the same element, right? And pick the properties from different languages for this unified thing, which is the Ezafe. We have to look at each language very closely and very carefully, the same way maybe that, at least for Persian, I think I've done a bit of that. And it's also conceivable that these elements, even historically, might have started off as the same thing, right? They have the same historical, point, but they might have developed into different things in different languages. So, for example, the mere coexistence of this varying, I think, Gilaki, at least in this grammar, the Ezafe cases and this kind of reverse order, the fact that they exist alongside each other should be an indication that maybe for the grammar of Gilaki today, this is not the same thing. It's something completely different from the Persian Ezafe, or possibly completely different. I think I'll end on that note. Thank you so much.
So we have a short questions. Any questions? I would request to speak louder when you ask the question because we have one more.
Oh, the microphone. I can move it.
Just repeat the question.
I guess.
Oh, I think you need it actually.
So, thank you so much for your help. I'm just wondering if it turns out that Ezafe started as a relative particle in Old Persian and in Arsalan, for example, and then it started the function that now it has in modern Persian. Does it have any bearing on what you suggest? Because if it started as a relative particle, then it was post-nominal order. So we had the noun and then the relative particle and all the modifiers that follow. But you suggest that the original order was pre-nominal. Now I'm just wondering if, I know that the source of Ezafe is not clear yet, but if it turns out that it was the relative particle, does it have any influence on the...
I don't think so necessarily. I mean, it's definitely interesting. It looks like that's what it is, at least what some historical linguists claim, and I'm not a historical linguist, so I can't take, sort of confirm that or anything, but it looks like it used to be that just regular modifiers would be prenominal without anything, and it was the Ezafe which had, it was the relative clause which had the Ezafe, which perhaps later took on this role of being used for any modifier. I don't think it has any immediate bearing for sort of any synchronic perspective of what it is for the grammar now. It might have some connection to that issue of because relative clauses, what are relative clauses, right? So for a lot of people, they would suggest that relative clauses also have this kind of source of prenominal source, and there's this kind of movement that leads to that. So for the Cinque style, for example, system, basically the source of indirect modification is the relative, reduced relative clause or relative clause. So I think here's the thing. What's perhaps a little bit strange, I guess I can move. Perhaps a little bit strange is that I'm fine. Is that you even get it with clear direct modification elements in modern Persian. So things like alleged or former, رئیس جمهور قبلی, right? These are cases of very clear direct modification. You still get them, even though you can't say رئیس جمهوری که قبلی است. So this is former president. The president that's former is terrible. So somehow we have to accept that it has taken a role which is beyond just a relative connector now, because otherwise you shouldn't be able to use it in that context.
Yeah, I have a general question. I mean, you've been involved in this discussion whether all sorts of things in other languages are Ezafe or not. But I think isn't that a question of definition? I mean, is Ezafe a general linguistic term, or is it just a sort of conjunction which can do different things in different languages, and just because it's a vowel, it doesn't mean that it's in Ezafe or not? I mean, it's just a question of definition.
That's exactly my question. That's exactly my issue, Marcel. So basically what has happened is, I think, it's suddenly it's almost become a kind of a fashion to call everything as, maybe they're right in the end, we have to look at them, but it's exactly that the problem that I have, which is looking at these different languages. Now suddenly people are saying, oh, this is Ezafe, Albanian has Ezafe, that has Ezafe, and then you look at the distribution, it's different. So the mere fact that we have these little elements that show up in the noun phrase and they're peculiar doesn't mean they're the same thing. And this is exactly the starting point for my next step in this project, which is to figure out what these little things are. And my guess at this point is they most likely are very different things. For example, I'm kind of convinced, maybe because I know much less about Albanian, by reading their article that Albanian, maybe it's a D element, a determiner element. But it doesn't make sense for the Persian case.
One more. There is one D element in Chinese, which does some very similar things to
Absolutely.
as well.
Absolutely. So that is actually the title of, well, maybe I can't get the title right, but one of Larson's papers is De as the reverse Ezafe marker. So that's what his claim is. That's actually a reverse Ezafe, and he says, yeah. So which is he suggests that it is similar to Gilaki and Mazandarani. The issue I have is, well, for one, I've seen already in Gilaki there's a difference because at least you have the Ezafe. And the other is, I think in Chinese, I haven't looked at Chinese closely, but I think it's optional. At least in many countries you can drop it. So I think that already says this is probably something different. So we need to look at everything very closely. This is my key point. But yeah, that's the point that's been raised. Who was next? Yes, please.
Sure. I wanted to ask about your particular analysis in 20, because it makes sense, to have the SFA as a realization of an agreement head, but I'm wondering about the Y's and the X's, because so far as I know, they don't ever, probably in any language, have any chronological realization, or do they? Are they just there because of theory internal reasons?
I think, to be honest, yes. So I think the literature that uses this type of analysis is using it because you need because of the facts that you find that you try to account for this sort of asymmetry, and they're there to facilitate this kind of roll-up movement. I agree with you. For me, I think one can start looking beyond this. I'm beginning to think maybe there's some sort of projection story for it, where you actually have symmetric merge, and this movement is actually the result of some kind of breaking that symmetry and labeling issue. I don't know if you know the Chomsky 2013 kind of stuff. Maybe that's a more fruitful possibility. There is nothing very insightful about doing this. Yes, it is to facilitate the mechanics of the system.
Right, because it's the adjective phrases that cause the need for the agreement on top of them, except they're not on top of them. Yeah.
Yes, the adjective phrase, yeah, but you know, again, like, so these are there to facilitate. So basically, the idea is, you know, you don't have any adjective in this system. So for Kane, there is no adjunction, right? So these YPs and XPs and so on, they are where these adjectives are placed. And well, at least for Cinque, I think he suggests that in some languages it's actually the head. So maybe the adjectives themselves could be in the head position. So that's what they do. And then the agreement is really for facilitating the movement. Yes. Yeah. No,
Arsalan, will you
absolutely.
repeat the question for the people listening to the
Oh.
camera?
What governs what? Is it the Ezafe governing the syntax semantics, or the syntax semantics governing the Ezafe? Essentially, that's the key question is, what is Ezafe, right? And to be honest, I don't have a clear answer to that, right? Because it still remains to be something that doesn't seem to do much syntactically or semantically. But maybe the closest thing you can find to it is the Dickens idea that, you know, when you have these inversion processes, you see this realization of a linker. So in that sense, it's a linker. Does that help? Maybe. People like Savoia and Franco and Manzini, to give them credit, at least they're trying to say it's something that we know more about, which is, okay, it's a determiner. Poof, you know, we can stop working on it because now we know it's a determiner. But then it's not a determiner when you look at Persian. Like, it doesn't fit the properties that it has. I don't have a clear answer. It's something which I've suggested is related, like then they can relate it to this process of movement. Whether that's correct or not.
Question here.
So, if I have two questions, but if there's no time to answer both or one of them, I won't be offended. The first is about the you mentioned this definite marker, which is phonologically identical, I suppose, to the Ezafe, and I'm wondering if there'd be any worth in investigating a deeper relationship between the two, whether historically or synchronically. I mean, the main question there is, can you have both in the same DP? No, you can't.
And this is what Savoia and Franco et al. Have used to argue that they're the same thing. I don't think it's correct. For one, you get the definite marker definitely on a bare noun. So, and the positions are very different. The positions they appear in are different. If they were in the same, so they say complementarity for us in syntax shows they're the same thing. That's not true. Complementarity in the same position tells us that they're the same thing, and that's not what's happening. I have an analysis of it in my 2014 paper. It's very tentative. I think it's a good start. It has a lot of restrictions, the definite, colloquial definite marker, which the Ezafe doesn't have. So they really do see, and it's stressed. Like, the prosody is very different. To be honest, a vowel it's the easiest thing. Like, you know, it could be anything, right? Like, it's to say, if it was like Kahnenuyipour, and it happened to be the same, then I would have a very hard time to say they're two different things. Well, I have a brother though, but anyway. So your second question?
The second question was, I'm thinking about the Cinque hierarchy and the adjectives having different semantics, really. And I'm wondering if, so I know in Spanish, if you say like coche nuevo, it means like a car that's new in like a very universal sense. It's like one that, you know, just came off the factory line. But if you say nuevo coche, it's more like it's new to the owner of the car.
Yeah,
and I'm wondering if that
like
holds
French.
for, and I'm wondering if that holds in the Ezafe versus pre-nominal modification case.
You won't find anything for Ezafe looking at those, because you'll get the Ezafe all over the place. So in other words, whether it's direct, indirect, or anything, you get the Ezafe, right? So that's a simple.
Thank you. This was really a great talk because this is sort of, excuse my language, hardcore linguistics, but we deal with that in everyday classes. And actually, with Ezafe, actually, I think Nargis would agree with me that we emphasize that Ezafe is the crux of Persian language because you give information. I think there is a link between syntax and semantics. It makes a big difference. For example, you mentioned the word karkhane. You could also say karekhane. It will have two different meanings. So the context will sometimes help us to understand that. And with the superlative, badtarin. So really, the syntax makes a big difference. If it comes there, then the rule tells you that you don't need to use that a there, whatever sound it is, right? And as we know, Farsi has also influenced the Ottoman Turkish. Maybe we could look and see how did that change. Is there a change in the structure of Ottoman Turkish? Because they use that all the time. And a suggestion that I had was that we give a talk about this issue Ezafe. I think an Indian colleague of mine in Hindi told me that they do exactly like Farsi. There's no, apostrophe that we do in English, But in Hindi they do that, so that might be something to look into that to see maybe there is some, wider range of,
Yeah, I didn't think that Hindi had anything like it, but I would be interested.
That's what she said. She said exactly like Farsi what we were saying. Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you very much. No, Ezafe is a big issue, big problem for also language processing, because we don't write the vowels. We have a consonantal writing system, and it's prone to ambiguities all the time. Like even any educated person can read a sentence and whoops, I read it without the Ezafe because I thought this is where the subject ends and this is where the object begins, but it was actually a noun modifying the previous. So you have to reread. It's a huge issue. The language was not supposed to become consonant.
You added a lot of Ezafe to our knowledge.
Ezafe means extra stuff, by the way, so that's what it means. Hopefully not extra useless stuff, though.
Okay, I think we might have time for one last question. Okay, great. Okay, so now